is Michelle. I'm the Director of Refugee Arrival Services at Arrive Ministries. I've been here close to 3.5 years, and I'm really glad that you were willing to stick around for one more session. And I didn't have a choice of who you were listening to this time around, so I'm sorry if you were hoping it was going to be something else. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about the refugee process of how individuals would come from a country far, far away to a place like Minnesota. And try to tie in a little bit about what my colleagues have talked about today and done an awesome job with. So hopefully this will be interesting to you. Hopefully you'll learn something, and I'm certainly willing to answer some questions as we go, or if you want to save them for the end as well, once you've kind of seen what we've talked about. So I think one of the most common questions that we kind of have when we're meeting people is, how can I help you? So especially in this work where there's a lot of services provision. So when you hear, you say that word, or you say the sentence to somebody, you say, how can I help you? What kind of comes to mind in terms of, what do you need? Why are you asking someone if you can help them? What are the assumptions that you have? And you can feel free to just shout some words out or just things. Why would you ask someone this question, or what would you, if someone asked you, what would you assume?
You assume they need help?
Yeah, you assume they need something?
They don't know how to do it on their own.
Yep, that they're not able to do something on their own.
So I have something to offer.
Yep, and that I'm the one who can add to this because there's a deficit. There's something you don't have. There must be something that I have. Just keeping that in mind a little bit, because I think that's kind of one of the crux of the things that we've been talking about today, is how does helping apply to this category of people that we're going to talk about today, and how does the way we define help change our relationships with the individuals that we're interacting. So just to put this a little bit in perspective, these numbers are updated as of the middle of June. They come from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, which is the UN Refugee Agency. It's an excellent website for statistics and stories and information, so I definitely recommend going there. But as of the middle of June, there are over 65 million people around the world who are displaced. Of those 65 million people, 22.5 million are refugees. There's about 40 million internally displaced people, which are people who may have had the same experiences as a refugee, but instead of actually leaving their country of origin, have moved to a different part within their country and therefore are not considered refugees. There's also about 2.8 or so million asylum seekers, that together those three numbers come up to the 65.6 million. The number that I think is particularly interesting on here, and those numbers are huge, that's really hard to conceptualize, is the number 189,300. That number is the number of people who were resettled in any country around the world in 2016. If you do the math, which I did, 189,300 divided by 22.5 million is 0.8%. So less than 1% of all refugees worldwide were resettled last year. Just some perspective of who we're talking about, and thinking about our own country and numbers of people that we're allowing in, and just the percentage of what that looks like across the whole world. If you're interested, the graphs on the bottom just kind of show where individuals are coming from. And the top hosting countries, just to point out, a hosting country is not the United States. The United States is a resettlement option for people. A hosting country is a country that informally, whether there's an urban setting that refugees are going to, or there's perhaps a camp set up, those are the countries where those places are. So Turkey is at about almost 3 million refugees living in Turkey. And the second one is Pakistan. So how would someone get in a situation, or leave their home, and be able to come to us here? I'm going to do kind of a higher level overview of this because there's a lot of information, and there's a couple other things I want to talk about today. So if there are specific questions you have about this in particular, I'm happy to answer those at the end as well. So I think the first obvious step of this whole process is an individual's decision to leave. And I think that a lot of times we think about this being kind of a planned and methodical decision. So we watch situations start deteriorating around us, we see some of our neighbors being harassed or being persecuted, and we just decide as a family unit one day, I think we're going to leave our country. Well, it could be an option for some of our families. I think more than likely, though, it's not that straightforward. What I like to think about sometimes is all the people who are closest to me, I'm generally not physically with them, even at one point in the day. You know, maybe I see some people that I'm really close with sometimes, but everyone has their own lives. They're working, they're going to school, they're doing other things. And I don't always have a chance to get all those people together with me, even my nuclear family, and go somewhere at a split second. And I think a lot of our families are making those decisions because suddenly one day everything is marginally okay, and maybe a militia comes into their community or something really bad happens and they have to make that split-second decision. So I point that out because a lot of our families experience a lot of separation because maybe one parent is at work, maybe the kids are at school. There's times when part of the family will flee one direction and the rest of the family will come home and have no idea where they went. Amazingly, some of our families are able to find each other, whether that's in camps at some point or even potentially through resettlement and what Christine was talking about with immigration, finding a family member that they thought had been perhaps killed, didn't know they were alive, and trying to file to have them to join their family here. But that can take many years, and a lot of families don't necessarily know what happened. So that is the first step. As I mentioned, I think in some previous presentations too, a refugee has to actually cross their country, the border of their country of origin, so they have to leave and go to a new country and register with the UN that has a processing center in that country. So the initial arrival at the camp, a little bit of what I say today will be framed by my own experience. I was able to visit the Kakuma refugee camp 2 years ago, which is in northwest Kenya. And so by speaking with some of the NGOs that work there and the UN that work there and also some of the refugee families as well, this is kind of based on their experience. But in most places, like there was in Kenya, there was a place kind of like a transit center for refugees first initially cross the border. In the case of the Kakuma camp, the UN kind of created some convoys essentially that every week, a couple times, would go and see how many people were there and bring them into like the camp proper. At that point, refugees are going to just stay kind of in like a reception center is what they call it for a couple weeks where they initiate some of their paperwork. You know, this is who I am, this is my family member. They get a brief medical check, just very kind of cursory stuff. They also register, in the case of Kenya, with a place called the Department of Refugee Affairs. Different countries probably have different names for that entity, but they're just kind of letting their presence be known in that country. At some point, they'll be given kind of a plot of land to have. In Kenya, they are also given a tent. There's different, based on the environments that camps are in the countries that families are in, the actual resources could be a little bit different just based on the climate or the resources that are even available. But then families are kind of just left alone. They have a ration card, so they're going to get monthly or bi-monthly distribution based on the resources that are available. But at that point, refugees are not even legally determined refugees, which sounds kind of silly because I just told you as long as they fled their country and went to another one, then they're a refugee. That's true, but legally they have to be determined to have refugee status. So when a refugee first initiates all this paperwork and they get their ration card, they're going to be given a date for an interview, and that interview is called a refugee status determination interview. At that point, they're going to have to prove that they actually have experienced persecution and have those conversations in order to be deemed a refugee. Normally, those interviews are about 2 or 3 years out. So you're going to have refugees who are in a camp for 2 or 3 years before they're even potentially considered for resettlement. So I think that's something really important to know, is that I think there's a lot of narratives sometimes that refugees just come in to different countries, and that's really not the case. Most of the families that we've been working with, we get the date that they have fled their country, and we also get the date that they have registered with the UN. And I would say most of our families have registered with the UN in the late 90s. So you're talking close to 20 years from that registration point to when they would be coming here. I'll talk ahead a little bit. So in that time frame, both kind of before the refugee status determination interview and then after that, there's just a very prolonged period of waiting. The way that the process would work is that if after those few years you had your interview and you were determined to be a refugee, at that point, the UN would look at your case and say, I wonder if this family would be a good candidate for resettlement. If you are determined to not have refugee status, you're required to return your ration card and you're supposed to leave the country. That that part is more up to the host country. So in the case when I visited Kenya, that would have been up to the Kenyan government to decide how strict they were going to be on forcing people to leave. And so there are many people who will just stay in a camp because going back still isn't better than being kind of in the camp with very few resources. So in addition to kind of that prolonged waiting is this reality of how unlikely resettlement actually is. So if you're interested in kind of how the UN does selections of who gets resettled and those types of things, there is a lot of information online. They have like a big handbook that explains their processes. But basically they have 6 categories of people that they consider the most vulnerable, and those individuals are going to be the ones that are considered for resettlement. So one example of that would be a survivor of trauma or torture. And they're really looking at people who, the camp is not great, I can tell you. The camp is not a great situation, but they're looking to resettle people for whom being in the camp is a heightened level of danger for them. So perhaps a single mom, or like I said, a survivor of torture or something like that. Resettlement is considered the 3rd durable solution by the UNHCR. The first 2, their preferred one, the first one would be repatriation. So that would essentially mean a conflict gets better or a family feels like it's safe for them to return home and the family voluntarily chooses to go back to their country of origin. They cannot be forced to go either by the UN or the host country, but they can make their decision to leave the camp. So sometimes people ask me, can they leave the camp? The answer is yes, they can always leave the camp. Sometimes people will go back when conflicts seem to get a little bit better, and then things will erupt again, and then they'll return to the camp. So it's a pretty porous border in terms of people coming and going. That is not really an option for a lot of our families because if you look at the conflicts in the world today, most of those have been going on for a while, and I don't see really great solutions in the near future for those conflicts, so that's not really an option for a lot of families. The second option would be local integration. So that would be a situation where the host country that the family is in says, we're not going to let you permanently stay here, we're not going to give you permanent status or any type of pathway to citizenship, but we will give you perhaps a work permit. So instead of having you rely on rations in a camp, you can earn, not too much because then maybe you owe taxes to our government, but you're not even a citizen, so that wouldn't make sense. But just a little bit so that you're a little bit more self-sufficient. I don't know of really many camps where that, or many countries where that's the case. I have heard that Uganda has been doing that lately. But again, that's something if you're interested in, you can certainly look into. And that leaves the third option as resettlement, which we've already talked about is a less than 1% chance for our families. If you've followed a lot of what's gone on, particularly in this country this year, in terms of how many people we allow into the country, initially hoped to resettle 110,000 refugees this year. We're hovering around 52,000, and our program year ends next week because we go along the fiscal year. So thinking about a 55% or so decrease in how many people we allow into the country, that has a very big impact on that 0.8% because we do take in a fairly high number of refugees normally. This I just thought was kind of nice to look at. It's even more synthesized version of things than what I was saying, but this is again, just kind of a little process of different things that families are going through. If they are a family that is considered for resettlement, the UN is actually going to make a referral to a country, so a refugee can have a preference. They can say, first choice I'd like to go to the US, second choice I'd like to go to Canada, whatever the case may be, but it's ultimately the UN's decision. So refugees does not get to choose where they end up. Again, all of the interviews that go into that and all the data collection and all of those types of things can take many years. If at any point your case changes, so if someone were to have a baby or something like that, the case has to restart at the beginning because they have to go through all of the same processes that initiated the case in the first place. If someone passes away, they have to be taken off the case and you have to go back and do various things too. So while this looks very linear and when I talk about it, it sounds great, you just follow the steps, there's no case I think that has ever just gone through the steps in a very, timely manner like that. Yep.
Is the reason that they're so long for the resettlement really because it takes that long to process it, or is it just the bottleneck finding a host country to accept them?
Yeah, so the question is if the delay in processing is the actual processing or if it's finding a host country. I would say it's kind of a mixture of that. For the things that I just mentioned, people's situations change. If they do leave the camp for a while, they may have some of their security checks or something expire, and then if they come back, then they have to be, start over in some of those areas. But the UN has a lot of capacity constraints, both in terms of resources they can provide and personnel that they can have doing that part of the interview and kind of the management of the camp. Even this year, as a result of particularly what the US has done in terms of not wanting to let refugees in, a lot of the processing centers in places like Kenya and others have cut staff significantly, sometimes up to 50%. So there's less people to even go through the material. But absolutely, if there's less places for refugees to be resettled in any country, the UN is not going to try to interview as many people because there's not going to be as many options to place them. So it's never really, one for one. They're not only going to interview, 50,000 people for the US, but there's usually kind of a continuous, pipeline that's going. But they're obviously not going to interview twice that number if not all those people can come. But it's a good question. Yes?
When someone is in a camp, can they only leave if they're going back to their original country, or are they free to continue on somewhere else?
Sure. Question is if the family if they leave the camp, if they can only go back to their country of origin. They can go anywhere, and sometimes we'll have families who've actually spent good chunks of time in maybe 2 or 3 camps. Our families are very savvy, and I just love their resilience. They hear things that this camp might offer better chances of being resettled, or this, in Uganda there's an opportunity to have a job. And people want the best option for themselves, like all of us do. So there's times when people can go to, maybe someone was born in one camp and then their family moved after a few years as well. So. One thing I wanted to point out too is that at any point in this process, until about 2 years ago, denial was final. In 2015, the UN did start developing this appeals process, so families could appeal if they'd been denied to go to a certain country. But knowing how complicated this process is, I have no idea how fruitful an appeals process would actually work, because there's not even enough capacity to deal with the actual process. So then just to kind of finish up looking at this graphic here, if a family is considered for resettlement by the UN, they get referred to a country like the US. That country then takes over all of the security checks and things like that. So in the case of the US, it's USCIS, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, that would step in. They would receive the referral from the UN, and they do what's called circuit rides. So they'll go into camps for probably 2 or 3 weeks at a time. They'll get through as many cases as they can, and they actually physically interview the families that are in the camps. And they'll make some determinations there. They'll bring all the paperwork back to the US, and they will do this whole vetting process that you hear about, at least 6 different security checks, and try to see if there's any connections with a terrorist group or anything like that that would make this family kind of questionable as in terms of a family that we should be resettling here. I believe last year, 52% of people who were referred to the US for resettlement were denied. So it's not even guaranteed that if you're considered good for a country that you would be taken. In the case of the US, if there is found to be any tie with a terrorist group, it's an automatic denial. Even if it was something where you were forced, maybe someone held a gun to your head or something, and forced you to pay money to a group that you didn't agree with, it doesn't matter what the reason is. And that's why kind of this appeals process, one of the reasons that this appeals process, I think, was put in place to try to show that families aren't always necessarily able to make those choices because of the influence in their environments. But assuming all of that were to work, you've gone through all the UN interviews, the US has checked you and said you're good to go, you would be approved for resettlement in a country. And it's shortly around that point that an office like mine would be notified. So there are 9 national agencies in the US that do resettlement, and our national that we're connected with is World Relief. They're all out on the East Coast, and they meet weekly for what's called an allocations process. And these are for cases that probably, barring any weird circumstances, will travel within 2 to 6 months. And they're really just looking at, has this case identified someone in the US in a particular state that they want to be reunited with? If so, we should make sure they're served by an agency in that state. If not, they could go to any state in the US, get the same services, but it just doesn't matter as much where they're resettled. So in Minnesota, I would say about 95% of our cases have what's called a US tie. So that's someone overseas has said, I want to be reunited with my mom, with my cousin, something like that. If you've heard the talk lately about this bona fide relationship requirement, that we can get into that at some point if you want, but that kind of delineated who counted as a good US tie, so mom, dad, spouse type of thing, and who was excluded. Friends were excluded, whereas in the past that's been okay. The other 4 or 5% of people are what's called free cases. They're not free, they just don't have an anchor. Here, they haven't identified someone and they could go to any state. So that's just something to consider. When our offices have those weekly meetings, they're sending, as a result of that, usually a couple cases to my office, and I'm calling the person that the family overseas has listed, making sure that they're actually in Minnesota, because if they're not, I'm going to send the case back and ask them to reallocate it to an office that can serve them in the state where the family is. And I'm just checking to see if they actually want to be reunited together. So even if I were to call someone and they said, yeah, I'm here, but I don't even like my friend anymore, it doesn't matter because my office is required to serve them, and that's fine. But it's also just kind of an internal assessment for us to know how much help and support can the family give and how much is my office going to have to do for this family. While all that stuff is going on, there's kind of some final medical checks that the family is doing overseas. Depending on where they are, they usually participate in a cultural orientation that's done by the country in which they're going to be resettled. So I was able to go into one of the classrooms that they use in Kakuma. They have a bed and a bathtub and a fridge and all those types of things. There's lots of appliances to try to show families kind of what the reality of their new housing situation will be. And there's a lot of information that I didn't see but was told that like the US will bring in a lot of posters and just different materials and stuff when they're there to try to help families to understand what some of their realities of their life will be like. So that's that. So thinking about refugee resettlement, what would you say are some of the goals? So someone has gone through this process that, again, very much just glossed over now. Probably took, 12, 15 plus years, depending on where they're coming from. Here in the US, what do you think our goals are? Or what would your goals be for families going through refugee resettlement? Be safe, be able to take care of themselves and their families.
Reunification of families.
Yep, putting some families back together, making them whole again.
Being able to become independent,
Independence.
Becoming integrated with our society.
Integrated with our communities, understanding how we do things in this country. Great. Well, I like all of your answers, but when it comes down to it, the number one goal is financial self-sufficiency, which makes sense because we're bringing families here who don't have, income saved up. They're going to be eligible for benefits right away. We're going to get them connected with job counselors right away. So the focus of the program really is, here's this family, you get 90 days to work with them and make them self-sufficient, preferably financially self-sufficient. So what I think, that's great. I do want our families to be able to take care of themselves, but I think the value that all of you in this room bring, and hopefully what my staff do to some extent too, but for a much shorter amount of time, is all those other things that you've mentioned. Independence, feeling connected to communities, feeling safe, feeling like you belong somewhere, because most of our families don't feel like they've belonged anywhere for a long time. So I just want to highlight how unique of a privilege you have to be able to interact with someone and kind of intersect with their lives at this point.
Well, since that really is such a short time, do you have any statistics on how many actually get to the point where they're self-sufficient in 3 months?
That is a great question. So the question is just statistics on how quickly families achieve self-sufficiency. I do not have that, but I do know that the Refugee Programs Office within Minnesota Department of Human Services has been doing a lot of work around stuff like that recently, particularly in terms of how quickly refugees get off of public assistance. And I don't like to quote things that I can't fully give you a citation on, but the state refugee coordinator has talked about the fact that refugees get off of assistance quicker than individuals born in this country who are accessing benefits. So I don't know how public that data is going to be or when they're going to publish that, but that's certainly something that we at Arrive would like to highlight and can be sharing as a resource. But there is definitely some stuff done around that to just talk about the realities and try to combat some of the, what I would consider more negative narratives about welcoming families here. So I often talk about how our work is just very much alphabet soup because we have tons of acronyms. We also just have a lot of layers of people that we work with. So there's not going to be a quiz after this or anything, but just for some perspective of, I already talked about all these agencies overseas that do stuff, federal agency here that does stuff. Those things largely don't impact my work here because I don't choose who comes here, I don't pick those cases or anything like that, but these are some people who are entities that are much more relevant for us. So like I mentioned, the UNHCR, just kind of the initiating body for everything. USRAP stands for the United States Refugee Admissions Program. I was hoping to have some good news by today in terms of this presidential determination, but none have been made. So basically every year the president will sign into law by October 1 what's called the presidential determination, which will say these amount of people can come to the U.S. as refugees every year. Normally that's done in mid-September, so it can correspond with the budget for the program, which can be part of the national budget. We have not heard that presidential determination yet, so we're hoping that it will come next week because without it, the program will be suspended until something's in place. We're all assuming it's going to be 50,000 this year because that's what it was knocked down to the current fiscal year, but haven't heard anything about that yet. So that's kind of how the president is involved in this. Usually the numbers that are created from this are from what's called a report to Congress. So Congress is kind of working on, here are some areas that are really affected in the world, and because of this, we propose this number of people, but the president can decide, and the number is done by regions, so it's not by country or anything like that. It's saying 35,000 from Middle East, 15,000 from Asia, those types of things. I mentioned there's 9 national refugee resettlement agencies. Interestingly, 7 of the 9 have a faith-based affiliation because prior to 1980, what we just quoted on the previous slide when the Refugee Act was in place, resettlement was very much an informal thing, an outgrowth of World War II and the refugees that were generated there. So 1980 was when it actually kind of became codified, and so instead of having churches being involved in a lot of like sponsorship and stuff, it became a federal program of public-private partnership like that. The PRM, Department of State's Bureau of Populations, Refugees, and Migration, is kind of the entity within the State Department that administers this program. They create what's called a cooperative agreement that is signed by the 9 national agencies, and then indirectly we agree to as well. It talks about everything from what we need to give families. So if you have been on an RLM team that's collected stuff and wondered why we've asked for like a can opener or something like that, it's in the agreement. The can opener has one line, it is a requirement. So they just stipulate a lot of those services. And they talk a lot too about if you want to ever open like a sub-office or something like that. So it just kind of outlines the rules of the program. And also if you're irritated by all the appointments you're doing with your families right away, like they just got here, why are we doing all these things? Also a requirement, which we'll talk about in a moment, certain timelines to get services done. But there's also a lot of people that are probably more closer involved in this. Like I mentioned in regards to that report about financial self-sufficiency, the Minnesota Department of Human Services Refugee Programs Office has been doing a lot of work lately. I think they're overhauling their website and doing a lot more statistics-based stuff just in light of the attitude that has developed or been resurfacing in our communities. There's also a lot of interaction with public health entities, education systems, the healthcare system in general, and different county-based programs. There are some contract-based services that our office does. We have a cash assistance program for people who don't qualify for the state program, employment services, immigration services. Those are federal dollars that come through the state, and the state makes contracts with agencies like ours to provide those services. There are these VOLAGs, if you've heard, which stands for voluntary agencies. In addition to us in the Twin Cities, there's 4 others. And there's also, and that's Catholic Charities, Lutheran Social Service, Minnesota Council of Churches, and International Institute of Minnesota. Lutheran Social Service also has an office in St. Cloud, and Catholic Charities also has an office in Rochester. And then people like you, of course, are very much involved in the resettlement of our families. So this is, I just mentioned that there's all these requirements for when we have to do services. So this is a very brief overview of some of those things. Obviously, initially, kind of going back to our example here, we've had cases allocated to us. In a couple months, we're going to get notice that they're going to have a flight scheduled. We usually get 2 or 3 weeks notice of families coming. So in those couple of weeks, we're securing housing, we're getting basic need items together. We're assessing the case, are they a complex medical case? Should we be reaching out to public health ahead of time so that they're aware, so we can kind of develop a plan to get them seen by primary care really soon, all of those types of things. Once a family actually gets here, this is kind of our outline of services. Obviously, we do go to the airport and welcome them, and that's kind of like day 0. So their first home visit is their first day here. That's when the clock starts ticking on their 90 days. And these are some of those things that we do. Does this seem comprehensive? Would this be enough if you walked into a new country? Is there anything missing? Or is it just perfect? You're going to be good to go if we do all these things. What's some stuff that might be missing? Jobs? Transportation? How? Yeah. Do you think if I told you all of the things that you can assume are discussed in each of these categories, that would be sufficient for you to feel good and like you understood your community? Probably not. Exactly. Kind of in and out, and you're just trying to get your bearings, and I'm just talking to you about how you can be on this program for this long, and your kids have to go to school, and now you have to go do this, and now you have to do it all on your own without me. So I just put that up there as some perspective. I do think I have excellent staff in our RLM program as well, and all of you who assist with all of these things. But just knowing that 90 days is super short, and we have to do some of this stuff, it is important. But what you get to do and the relationships that you build are, I always say you have way more fun with our families than I get to do, because like Social Security isn't that fun. You just go and you sit down and you get your card and you leave, or you get your receipt and you leave. So you're really adding kind of a lot of beautiful stuff around the things that we're required to do. So I just want to speak super briefly on the financial realities for our families. You probably are familiar with some of these things if you've been matched with a family before, but every refugee who comes to the program, any age, doesn't change with age, receives $925 one time as a grant from the government. So they're not paying it back, but it is a one-time thing. All that money comes through offices like mine, and we're using that to pay rent and those things. So you can imagine what your expenses are, monthly or just weekly, and the things that you're spending money on, and just knowing what we're working with our families initially. They are, like I said, eligible for different public benefits. So there's, again, lots of alphabet soup going on. MFIP is just the national TANF program, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. MFIP is the Minnesota version, so that's food and cash assistance. RCA would be for refugees who don't qualify for that, so generally 18 plus who don't have minor children. General assistance to offset people who are going to school who are between 18 and 22. And then SSI, so Social Security or disability for qualifying refugees. Obviously, employment, we all know, is very important. The importance of budgeting, just knowing how little our families are working with sometimes, and we try to do some types of cost sharing with rent so that it's not just us paying all of it and then all of a sudden it's our families paying all of it, but helping families understand the value of a dollar. Most of our families have never paid rent before, they've just lived somewhere before. And even if they have, obviously it's a different currency. I know when I go to other countries, I don't feel the weight of my expenses the way that I do here because it doesn't mean as much to me as a dollar. And then it's probably fairly obvious to consider some of the challenges that our families have. And again, if you've been matched with a family, I'm sure you've walked through some of these things with them. Housing, obviously, is a huge one. We're asking landlords to house a family who does not have a job, who has no income, who has no rental history, oftentimes who's not even in the country yet, who's never probably lived in Western type of housing before, to partner with us and to offer a home for our families with our limited resources too in terms of finances. So I think that's something really important to think about, especially if you are with a family and you're kind of wondering maybe why their housing isn't as great as you had hoped for, or in their case, why it isn't as great as they had hoped for as well. And just kind of being aware of that. And like I said, 2 to 3 weeks notice. Sometimes it can be as short as four working days notice that a family's coming, so we're scrambling. And if it's in the middle of the month, that's going to be harder than perhaps if it's the end of the month and stuff is going to come available. Systems are obviously tricky. How do you stay eligible for benefits? How do you make all your appointments? How do you get ready to go? How do you pay rent and how do you budget and balance all the other expenses that you'll have? Certainly difficulties with language sometimes. Cultural adjustment is just kind of ongoing. Just learning different rules, learning why people do things the way that they do in this country. And I think a big one too would be identity. I think particularly of like our teenagers who come, who oftentimes may have been born in their family's country of origin, or maybe not, but either way probably grew up in a camp and now they're coming here. So is their identity in their ethnicity? Is it in the place they grew up? Are they American? When are they American? Do they ever feel American, or what does that mean? So just thinking about those things. And then I just want to make a few comments here, and we have a few kind of interactive slides coming up. But thinking about help. So what are some things a refugee needs? What would you say are some things that they need when they first get here? A hug. I like that. Friends. Some of the things we talked about. A house maybe. Food. Mm-hmm.
Clothing appropriate for the area.
Mm-hmm. So I think initially we're all thinking about the has not, and that's what we're going to respond to. And I don't think that's wrong, because that's why agencies like ours exist. It would be very impractical to bring someone here and not provide that type of assistance. So they need a place to live, food to eat, maybe help taking the bus, probably need some clothes, especially if they come in January from Thailand, help reading their mail. Probably they need help getting to doctor's appointments, making sure they have medication, knowing which doctors to see when. Like someone mentioned, they need friendship and community, and probably a whole lot of other things, but that's just a little list there. So I think one thing in having worked with our families, and particularly when families are matched with some of our volunteers, I think managing expectations is good to just touch on. So both expectations of the client and perhaps the expectations of the people working with the client. I put a couple questions up here, maybe some things to kind of think about as you go back and work with the families that you've been paired with or anything like that. But what is realistic? So is it realistic for someone who's been here 2 months to be able to send their teenager to driver's ed? Is it realistic for them to have a car? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. How does the personal experiences that you've had in your own life impact your perceptions of the family's abilities? Are there things that they have that are barriers to them that you were fortunate to not have had in your life? Are there just different assumptions that you've made or beliefs that you've had that impact how you're looking at the family and what they're able to bring? Like I said, are their expectations realistic? A lot of times our families will come here, and I mentioned housing as a big one, but sometimes I wonder what people tell our families before they come here. A lot of times it's the family who's been here for several years that creates an interesting picture of how things will be. I think more based on the successes that they've had and not so much based on their initial perception here. And I think there's also often the idea that I have to show everyone that I was successful here, so I can't talk about all that stuff that was difficult for me because I just want you to see how I've succeeded, which can be challenging for our families who want to be right there with them initially too, and we want that, but we also know that those types of successes are going to take time to develop. Asking yourself how what you're doing is helpful, and if you can't answer that question, then maybe thinking about that a little bit more as well. And looking at the disappointments that your families will have, and how you can help families turn those into opportunities as positives. Because I think a lot of our families come to this country, and many of our families have voiced this in similar ways, saying, I thought America was paradise. I thought everything was going to be okay here. And what I tell our families a lot when there's a lot of kind of, frustration or just not knowing what to do is they're trading one set of problems for another. I think that what we offer in this country, hopefully, is a lot more security and safety than what they've experienced in the past. But everything here is a challenge. Everything costs money. Everything has a rule. Everything has a system. Everything has one person to talk to about everything else, and that's not necessarily a situation our families have experienced before. So really trying to help families celebrate those smaller good things and turn things that didn't work out into opportunities to learn from. So I have two quick situations here that we'll just go through, and if you were in Carrie's presentation, you probably have an advantage here because you've already been thinking about this a little bit. But here's just a situation that I think frequently can happen. So you visit your family one time, and they're checking the balance on their EBT card. They only have $100 cash left on there for the month, and it will be 2 weeks before they receive the next month's cash allotment. You are very concerned about their money managing skills, so you create a new budgeting sheet explaining where their budgeting priorities should be. So in this situation, what are some things that the volunteer or whoever is involved with this family did well, and what are some things that maybe you're not sure about? And you can feel free to just shout them out if you think about it.
They should ask the family where they think they should be.
Mm-hmm. So asking the family kind of what their budgeting priorities would be.
Maybe let them list the things that they know they'll be spending money on.
Yeah. So ask the family to list out where their money is going to try to figure out why there's only $100 left.
Ask what their plan is.
Mm-hmm. Ask the family what their plan is. Maybe they have one they haven't shared with you. Is there anything that the volunteer did well in this scenario?
I think being proactive and just teaching them that in general, being proactive in America is normally advantageous
Mm-hmm.
is good.
So a little bit about advocating and being proactive and learning those things. Is their concern misplaced? Probably not. Does that volunteer perhaps have a good idea of how to manage money? I mean, there's a good chance that they do that well in their own lives. So I think what's hard sometimes is, I can't do anything right, I have to do things all this way. And I think I put this up here to make it a little tricky because I don't think it's totally straightforward. So I think that, in this situation, both the volunteer and the family have something to bring. And I think it's very valuable, as many people said, is to actually ask the family, what are your priorities and things like that. But allowing the family to really say that, and at that point, then using the skills that you have of your own money management, or just maybe examples in your own life, and explaining to them maybe why you're concerned. Or maybe you find out that they have an excellent plan and actually someone got a job that you didn't know about, and they have income coming in now, so this doesn't matter as much because they have other sources of income. So I always feel like the most genuine interactions with families are when you have those honest conversations and when you both are bringing good things together, because we all do have something to offer each other. So in this case, you get to make the choice. So your family arrived 3 weeks ago. One night after work, you visit the family and notice that the sink in the kitchen drains really slowly. They tell you it has been like this for a few days. Well, how do you respond? A learning opportunity? What could they learn, or what could you work with them on? Plumbing. You could teach them some plumbing skills.
If their language is adequate, you could point them toward the landlord.
Mm-hmm. So if they're able to communicate fairly decently with their landlord, try to encourage them to let the landlord know about the problem.
Take them to their first hardware store.
Yeah. So go on a field trip to the hardware store. Yeah.
Ask them what they're just putting in the sink.
Yes. Yeah. Ask them what might have gone down the drain, if someone's toy is down there or something. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe just ask them what their plan was for initially, if they were planning on fixing it eventually and just couldn't get around to it, or if they were just gonna just kind of let it go until basically wintering and all.
Sure. Asking the family what their plan was. I mean, if you hadn't stopped by tonight, maybe no one else on the team was going to come for another week. So what were they going to do?
Maybe they don't use garbage disposal.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe there's a garbage disposal or something's just wrong there.
Well, they just might not even know that's what it is. When someone's-
Yeah, it's true. So maybe it's not even a clock turn.
No,
I don't know.
it's not.
Sure. Yeah, so I think all those are very creative solutions. I think kind of the instinctual thing would be, well, I'm going to call the landlord because clearly they don't care about your house, which hopefully I think is not always the case. But really looking at kind of the cause, so like why is it like this? Sometimes we have families, maybe a better example would have been some of our families do their laundry in the bathtub, and that can cause, water damage and things like that. So in that instance, instead of like a hardware store in this case, doing something like, let's make sure you know where the laundry is. Is it in your building? Is it down the street? How do you clean your clothes? So really approaching it from a way of understanding of what may have led to this versus walking in and saying, well, they just don't know how to use the sink or they don't know what they're doing. And really empowering them that way too. I mean, maybe they don't need a plumber. Maybe there is something that's just a little bit stuck, and then they can know going forward, before I call the landlord, is there something I can do to make sure that I can fix this? Or even, if it was something went down the drain that shouldn't have, remembering, keeping track of what the kids are doing, or just as they're cooking, something can get lodged in there. So good work. All right, so I think I have a few moments here left. So before we talked about what a refugee needs, what are some things that a refugee has? Tenacity. Skills, abilities, knowing how to do certain things. Emotions, that's a good one. They feel things. Yeah. The way I kind of like to think about it, and I'm weird because I kind of think in metaphors sometimes, but I feel like a lot of the work that we get to do with our families is almost like a dusting off of things that have been covered up for a while. Refugee camps are essentially set up to be areas of dependence. You can't grow your own food, you have to get it from someone. You can't work, you get a very nominal amount of money in your monthly rations. And I think that a lot of times you get stuck in that, and if you're in a camp like that for as many years as our families are, you forget what you're capable of, and you forget that you have a lot to offer. So that's where my dusting off idea comes in, is that it's, not just fixing everything for our families, because we're not going to, even if we really want to and really try, but helping them see the value that they have underneath. So the couple things that I listed here, identifying the has, so just things to remember when you're working with families. And sometimes families do get super frustrating, not because they're refugees, but because they're human. So it's just some good things to remember. So refugees have inherent dignity and worth simply by virtue of being human. They have God-given talents and skills that they perhaps have not been able to exercise before or have had to put on hold for a while. They have a unique story, and we might not know the whole thing. We might never fully understand, and they might not tell us those things. And if we knew that, maybe we would understand them better, but it's their choice of what they want us to know. Refugees have a lot of strength and perseverance, and I like the word tenacity. They certainly have that. If they didn't have those things, they would not be here. There would have been other things that happened in their life that prevented them from making it to the U.S. They have personalities, and they have dispositions and demeanors that might not always match our own. So we might not always agree on everything. Refugees have the capacity to recover when mistakes are made, so it's okay if sometimes families make mistakes. Obviously, we want to advise them as best that we can and support them, but sometimes, as we know in our own lives, the best way to learn something is to do it wrong the first time. And that being said, refugees have the right to make their own decisions, even if those decisions don't make sense to you or me. So, my last little slide here. I know that this is a question I would probably be asking, like, great, I came to this training for a couple hours and now my whole world is destroyed and what I thought I could do to help people is just terrible and I should just quit and all these things. So, I want to end on a more positive note, and to do that, has anyone read the book What is the What by Dave Eggers? Okay. It's a very good story. It's about one of the Sudanese lost boys, and it kind of goes back and forth between his life fleeing his country, and he actually spent a lot of time in Kakuma, and then he was resettled in Atlanta, so it kind of looks at that, so I would highly recommend it. But one thing that I absolutely love about the book is the very last paragraph, which I'll just read to you here. It says, "Whatever I do, however I find a way to live, I will tell these stories. I've spoken to every person I've encountered these last difficult days. I speak to these people, and I speak to you because I cannot help it. It gives me strength, almost unbelievable strength, to know that you are there. I covet your eyes, your ears, the collapsible space between us. How blessed are we to have each other? I am alive, and you are alive, and so we must fill the air with our words. I will fill today, tomorrow, every day until I am taken back to God. I will tell stories to people who will listen, and to people who don't want to listen, to people who seek me out, and to those who run. All the while, I will know that you are there. How can I pretend that you do not exist? It would be almost as impossible as pretending that I do not exist. And so I ultimately believe at the end of the day that if you show up and if you are present, that that is the thing that matters the most. And when you make mistakes and when your family makes mistakes, you're just going to keep working through it and it's going to be okay. So I think the idea of today is we give you a lot of tools to work with, a lot of guidance, and hopefully some good resources that can help you. But even with that, you'll make mistakes. I make mistakes with our families all the time, and I just try not to make the same ones going forward. So that's my positive ending, because I think the fact that you are here and the fact that you are here with our families is the most important, especially for a group of people who've not had people there for them for a lot of their lives.